As they leave their own familiar neighborhood behind and head south, Karen feels more and more uncomfortable. Feels like looking for trouble, driving a Lexus through these decaying streets. "See, I'm trying," she wants to say to him, but she doesn't. She watches out the window at the depressing view, trying to remember, but nothing is coming back to her. "I think that's it," Tom says, pulling into a strip mall's empty parking lot and looking across the street at the derelict restaurant that they've heard so much about. They sit in the darkness looking at the ugly, boarded-up building. She doesn't want to get out of the car in this neighborhood. Now she just wants to go home. Nothing looks familiar. She's never seen this place before. She's never been here. She starts to tremble. "Let's go take a look, shall we?" Tom says a little callously. She'd never intended to get out of the car. She just meant to see the place from a distance. She shrinks back into her seat. "I don't want to." He gets out of the car anyway. She has no choice but to follow him. She doesn't want to sit here alone. She gets out of the car and closes her door angrily. She has to walk quickly to catch up with him as he crosses the street and strides toward the restaurant on the opposite side. She looks around nervously, but there's no one else in sight. Together, they stand in front of the building, say nothing. She can feel his recrimination in the set of his shoulders, the cold expression on his face. He knows she was here, and he can't forgive her for it. Without speaking, Tom heads around the side of the building toward the back. She follows him, stumbling a little in the dark because she feels unsteady on her feet. She's breathing quickly and it's making her lightheaded. She feels a terrible fear, but she recognizes nothing. She remembers nothing. At the back, the yellow police tape is mostly still up, but dragging a bit in places, moving in the breeze. "Is this helping at all?" Tom asks, turning to her. She shakes her head. She knows she looks frightened. "Let's go back, Tom," she says. He ignores her. "Let's go in." She hates him for challenging her this way, for not caring how frightened she is. She thinks about turning back and making her own way to the car. If she had had her keys with her, she'd drive away and leave him here. Instead, her anger gives her the courage to go after him under the police tape and up the back door. He pushes it with one elbow. Surprisingly, it opens. She supposes the police are done here and have left things as they found them. Tom walks in ahead of her. There's a light coming from the streetlight out front, slanting in through a break in the boarded-up window, enough light to see the interior fairly well. There's a dark stain on the floor where the body must have been, and a lingering, repellent odor, the smell of a rotting animal. She stops rigid, staring at the stain. Her hand goes involuntary to her mouth as if she might gag. Tom looks back at her. "Anything?" he says. "I've had enough," she says, and turns and stumbles out of the restaurant. Once outside, she bends forward and gulps deep, fresh breaths of air. When she lifts her head again, she's looking at a parking lot a short distance away. Tom comes up beside her and looks in the same direction. "I think that's where they found the tire tracks and the gloves," Tom says, and walks towards the parking lot. She watches him. He turns around after a few paces and says, "Coming?" "No, I'm going back to the car." She starts walking without looking at him. All this had done is frightened her. It hadn't helped her remember, and her efforts hadn't won her any goodwill or sympathy from Tom either. Tom watches Karen head back toward the strip mall. She's upset with him, but he doesn't care. It even gives him a nasty sort of satisfaction. After all, this is all her fault. He sees her cross the street and wait beside the car. He has the keys and she can't get in. He makes a show of looking around the parking lot, wondering where exactly her car had been parked, where the police had found their gloves. He takes his time. but he keeps an eye on her to make sure she's all right, standing alone beside an expensive car. Finally, he turns to her, unlocks the car, and drives them silently home. He reflects that all this little excursion has done is to further show the fault lines in their already fractured relationship. When they arrive home, it's late. Tom tosses his keys on the table inside the door and says, "I'm tired. I think I'll go to bed." He turns away from her and heads upstairs, and with each step he takes, his despair deepens. Bob lets himself into the house quietly. He peeks into the living room where he knows he'll find Bridget sitting in the dark. He knows she isn't waiting up for him. She used to, but she's not interested in him anymore. All she's interested in is the damn neighbors. He's hurting too. He could still love her if she could only move on from her grief about their childlessness. It's torn them apart and it's affecting her emotional health. She's always been the emotional one. He's always been the steady one, her rock. But now he doesn't know what to do. He knows how to talk to grieving families. He does it all day long. He's quite good at it. But he has failed miserably at it at home. He can't help his wife deal with her feelings of loss or deal properly with his own. "Bridget," he says softly, seeing the outline of her head dark against the back of the chair. For a moment, she is so still that he thinks she might be asleep. He takes a few more steps into the living room. When she speaks, it startles him. "Hi," she says. "Shouldn't you go to bed?" Bob asks, approaching and looking down at her with concern. She doesn't even raise her eyes to look at him. They are fixed on the house across the street. "Those detectives were back tonight, talking to Karen and Tom," she says. Bob doesn't know what the hell's going on with Karen and Tom Krupp. She seems to be in some kind of trouble. He doesn't really know them, but he knows Bridget and Karen are close. "What's going on, do you think?" Bridget shakes her head. "I don't know. Has Karen remembered anything yet?" "No," she finally turns to look at him. "I made brownies. Do you want one?" Karen watches Tom. Tom's retreating back, her heart sinking with each step he takes away from her. Still trembling, she goes into the kitchen and pours herself another shot of whiskey. Then she carries it into the living room and slumps onto the sofa, cradling it in her unsteady hands. She gulps the alcohol and stares at a blank spot on the wall. For how long, she has no idea. It's perfectly quiet. Suddenly, she hears the phone ring in the kitchen. Her entire body stiffens. The phone stops on the second ring. Tom must have picked it up in the bedroom. But all at once, she's remembering that other phone call. She closes her eyes. She's back in the kitchen making a salad, slicing a tomato on the cutting board. She expected Tom home soon. She was looking forward to seeing him. When the phone rang, she thought it might be him, saying he was going to be even later than expected, but it wasn't Tom. It's coming back to her now, and she concentrates. She wants to know. It was a voice she hadn't heard in almost 3 years. One she thought she'd never hear again. She'd know that voice anywhere. "Hello, Georgina." Her heart began to pound. Her mouth went dry. She considered ending the call without uttering a word, but that would be like a young child crouching and closing her eyes tightly, thinking no one could see her. She couldn't hang up the phone. She couldn't just close her eyes. He'd found her. She already knew he'd found her. He'd been in her house. She'd been waiting in plain view, trying to pretend this wasn't going to happen. And now it was. She'd fled that life, began over as someone else. She'd found unexpected happiness with Tom. And with one phone call, she could feel her new life shattering into a million jagged pieces. He gave her the address of an abandoned restaurant in a neighborhood she would never have set foot in otherwise. Then Karen hung up the phone. All she could think about was protecting herself and not letting anyone destroy what she now had with Tom. She saw the pink gloves sitting on the counter and grabbed them. She retrieved her gun from its hiding place in the furnace room, the gun that Tom knew nothing about, putting it with the gloves in a cloth bag. Then she swiped her car keys off the table and flew down the steps, not even thinking about locking the door or leaving a note for Tom. She drove, her hands tight around the steering wheel, staying just within the speed limit, her mind blank. For a moment, everything stops. Karen can't remember what happened next. She takes another gulp of whiskey, tries to relax. And then suddenly she remembers parking the car in that lot. She remembers pulling gloves out of the cloth bag and slipping them on. They look absurd. She took the gun out of the bag. She was trembling. She looked around to see if anyone was watching. The place was deserted. And then she got out of the car and walked nervously in the dark toward the back of the building where he told her to go. When she got there, the door was already slightly ajar, and she pushed it open with her gloved fingers. But here, her memory fails her. She waits. She tries to force it, but nothing will come. She fights tears of frustration. She still doesn't know what happened inside that restaurant. She still doesn't know he was killed. She must know what happened. How can she decide what to do if she doesn't know the truth? But she can see nothing more. What she saw tonight with Tom is all terribly familiar to her now. She can't bear to think about it anymore. She finishes her drink in one big gulp, puts the glass down on the coffee table, and buries her face in her